breaking.
This is Business Week, coming to you from our studio here in Lagos, the nation's commercial capital. I am Frank Omalape. Here's what coming up in a moment. Nigeria's headline inflation rate increased to 29.9% in January 2024 from 28.92% recorded in December 2023. This is according to the National Bureau of Statistics. Plus, importing food items to address the soaring cost of food production in the country is not an option. This is according to President Bola Tinubu while meeting with the 36 state governors in the week. And finally, outside Nigeria, the UK economy fell into recession at the end of 2023 as households cut back on spending in response to soaring interest rates and rising living costs. Well, this and many more are what to expect on the show today. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin now with some news. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Let's begin with some major stories now. President Bola Tinubu has said that importing food items to address the soaring cost of food production in the country is not an option at this point for this current administration, as Nigeria is potentially capable of feeding itself. The president, represented by the Minister of Information, Mr. Mohammed Idris, made the announcement in Abuja during a meeting with the 36 state governors of the Federation. The president also directed the National Security Advisor, the Director General of the Department of State Services, and the Inspector General of Police to cooperate with governors to end the hoarding of food commodities in the country.
At this point that the nation requires food to be brought out to the people so that we can control prices and put food on the table of most Nigerians, other commodity traders are busy hoarding these commodities so that Nigerians will suffer or they will make more money as a result. So the governors and Mr. President have taken this decision that security agencies will cooperate or collaborate with the state governors to ensure that this ends. Number two, a decision has also been taken that in the interest of our country, there will be no need for food importation at this point.
And away from there now, the National Bureau of Statistics says Nigeria's headline inflation rate increased to 29.9% in January from 28.92% recorded in December 2023. The Bureau said this in its Consumer Price Index and Inflation Report for December, which was released in Abuja. According to the Bureau, the figure, which is 0.98% point, is higher compared to the 28.92% recorded in December 2023. Similarly, on a year-on-year basis, the headline inflation rate hit 8.08%, point higher compared to the rate recorded in January 2023, which was 21.82%. The report says the increase in the headline index for January 2024 on a year-on-year basis and month-on-month basis was attributed to the increase in some items in the basket of goods and services at a divisional level. On a year-on-year basis in January 2024, the urban inflation rate was 31.95%, which was 9.4% higher compared to the 22.55% recorded in January 2023. And away from there now, the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, Mr. Gbenga Komolafe, says Nigeria has the potential to produce 2.2 million barrels per day of crude oil as against the current production of between 1.5 million and 1.6 million. Mr. Komolafe disclosed this at the 8th Sub-Saharan Africa International Petroleum Exhibition and Conference in Lagos. We have details in this report.
The global energy landscape is indeed in a state of rapid change in response to climate concerns. Industry players in Nigeria's oil and gas industry say the evolving energy dynamics must be calibrated to ensure energy justice, equity, inclusivity, and sustainability. This is a gathering of professionals in the oil and gas industry across the African continent The focus is on improving synergy and creating a platform to raise contending issues and proffer solutions aimed at achieving energy security across the board.
As a pivot of the Nigerian upstream, we are regulating the upstream strategically. We've been very strategic in our approach. We've put in place necessary regulatory framework to ensure that Nigeria benefits, that we optimize our hydrocarbon resources. Currently, we are doing, that is in oil, we are doing hovering around 1.5, 1.6 million barrels a day. But that technically, that is what I call potential, that we have technical liable now of 2.2 million barrels a day.
The NUPRC board said that part of the measures by the Commission was to improve transparency in hydrocarbon measurement and accounting. He added that the Commission engaged in collaborative work program administration with the E&P companies and close monitoring to ensure that they meet their work program obligations.
We've rolled out the metering regulation, you understand, all aimed at enhancing hydrocarbon accounting in a manner that we can cover areas of leakages. So for us, we believe that a combination of all these factors put together will take us to achieving the potential, you understand, which we have rolled out. So we are not packed up in any regard, anyway, as a regulator, we are very much focused and we're very strategic in the approach we are taking.
The Commission promises to work to help reposition the upstream oil and gas industry through strategic plans that aligns with the mandate of the PIA.
And outside Nigeria, the UK economy fell into recession at the end of 2023 as hard-pressed households cut back on spending in response to soaring interest rates and rising living costs. The Office for National Statistics said gross domestic product fell by a larger than expected 0.3% in the 3 months to December after a decline in all main sectors of the economy and a collapse in retail sales in the run-up to Christmas. This followed a drop of 0.1% in the third quarter, confirming a second consecutive quarter of falling national output, a technical definition of a recession. The figures will be a blow to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who is growing the economy and is one of 5 pledges he made in January 2023. And why Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is less than 3 weeks away from unveiling his latest budget. The figure for the final 3 months of last year was worse than 0.1% fall, widely forecast by financial markets and economists. Japan is no longer the 3rd largest economy in the world. The Asian country has lost that position to Germany after contracting for the last 6 months of 2023 and entering a recession. Official data shows that Japan's economy unexpectedly dropped due to weak domestic demand. This has raised uncertainty about the central bank's plans to exit its ultra-easy monetary policy this year. The country's gross domestic products contracted by a worse than expected 0.4% in the last 3 months of 2023 compared to a year earlier. This is coming after the economy declined by 3.3% in the previous quarter. Economists had expected the new data to show that Japan's GDP grew by more than 1% in the 4th quarter of last year. In October, the International Monetary Fund forecast that Germany was likely to overtake Japan as the world's 3rd largest economy when measured in US dollars. Well, those were some of the biggest stories in Business Week. We are coming up in a moment after this break. Our focus this week is on the power sector as the Minister of Power, Mr. Adebayo Adelabu, announced that the electricity subsidy is no longer sustainable. Well, that's our talking point in a moment when we come back from this break. Please stay with us. Thank you, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is Business Week coming to you from our studios. Yeah, let's get into our conversation for the day. The recent announcement by the Minister of Power, Mr. Adebayo Adelabu, that the electricity subsidy is no longer sustainable has continued to generate reactions. According to the Minister, the government is committed to settling a substantially inherited debt in the power sector, which amounts to over 3 trillion naira. However, experts have advised the federal government not to remove the electricity subsidy, saying such an act can lead to tough economic conditions. Well, for more perspective, I'm joined by the senior energy analyst, Ms. Noel Okwede, who is joining me virtually. Thank you for joining us now. So the Minister of Power As Adebayo Adelabu said in the week that it's not sustainable to continue to subsidize electricity. Give us your understanding of this.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, for that question. So I'll look at it from two perspectives. So economists like to look at things from the direct cost and also the opportunity cost. So the minister's statement is that the subsidy is unsustainable. So looking at it from the perspective of the government's finances, it is actually unsustainable. As we know, Nigeria is currently in the middle of a fiscal crisis where we're not earning enough because of lower oil production, and then we're spending a lot more. So if you look at our budget deficits keep ballooning and keep increasing, and adding on an electricity subsidy to that means even more higher spending without a commensurate increase in revenues. And the opportunity cost here is all the other things that the government could be doing with this funding, or with this funding that they're going to provide to the power sector. They could be developing infrastructure in the power sector, developing healthcare, education, but instead it's going to subsidize electricity prices for consumers, which in the long run don't have any developmental effects on the economy. On the other hand, if you look at it from the perspective of the power sector directly, where we'll see the direct impact. So for companies in the power sector, we know that there has been a liquidity crisis for years, with distribution companies unable to remit money to the generation companies or transmission companies, and that's also affecting gas supply companies. So we're seeing that even from previous years. So the subsidy isn't a new thing. Between 2014 and about 2019, Nigeria had a subsidy on electricity, and we saw the effect that had. So the government wasn't paying on time, again, because of fiscal issues, and that caused a huge backlog that has now accumulated and is now affecting gas supply companies and generation companies, because on paper, it looks like they're making money, but in reality, they have huge debts that are owed to them from the distribution companies. And so that affects their ability to improve their infrastructure, provide gas, generate electricity, and for consumers, it means that we have lower electricity supply and poorer service. But speaking about the consumers who are the benefactors of an electricity subsidy, right now, so for context, electricity prices in Nigeria for Band A customers, domestic customers, should be about 140 naira per kilowatt hour. But instead, we're seeing people pay about 70 naira per kilowatt hour. So that's like we're paying half of what we should be paying. For consumers, obviously, it means that electricity prices stay low. But the opportunity cost there is that it means, with all the issues that the subsidy is causing in the power sector, it means that the service that we're getting is much worse than what we should be getting. So you're paying 70 naira per kilowatt hour, but you're getting such poor service. Band A customers today aren't getting up to 20 hours because of gas supply constraints that have been plaguing the Nigerian power sector for the better part of the year and will likely continue up through Q1. So essentially, to recap, the subsidy on electricity prices, while it is cushioning the blow to consumer wallets, because it means that Nigerians have lower costs to deal with in terms of electricity supply, it also means that we're getting poorer supply, and it means that the government isn't able to focus their funds on more long-term development projects.
I would like you to talk to us more on the implication. If the government does decide to end the subsidy, there could be some negative effect, right? So how do you think Nigeria can manage the difficult choices that come with ending the subsidy?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's a really good question because, yesterday inflation numbers came out and we saw that food inflation is at over 35%, while annual inflation is at 29.9%. That means that compared to this time last year, Nigerians' prices have gone up by 30%. And we know that inflation, while it looks like the numbers say 30%, they usually feel like more than 30%. So basically what I'm trying to say is that consumers are definitely feeling the brunt of higher prices in terms of the fuel subsidy that was removed, higher prices generally with the dollar depreciating and Nigeria having so many things that we import, it means that a lot of people are struggling with high cost of living. So removing the subsidy will definitely cause some pain in the short run. And this is also something that we saw with the petrol subsidy removal. And that's why subsidy removals have to be clearly communicated, and there has to be a proper plan on how to, first of all, reduce the burden on the poorest consumers, while also making a plan for long-term development of the country in general. Because taking it back to basics, I mean, the reason why Nigerians can't afford to pay 114 naira per kilowatt hour is because of the high poverty rates that we're seeing. I mean, last year, the NBS released some numbers, and we saw that over 60% of Nigerians are multidimensionally poor. And this just means that, and that this was even before the subsidy removal and before we saw higher inflation numbers. So I imagine that now that number has even increased. And essentially, it just points to the low development and the low productivity of Nigerians, because employment levels are low, productivity is low, incomes are low, and it means that Nigerians can't afford a lot of basic things that their counterparts in other countries can afford. So essentially, removing the subsidy requires two responses: a short-term response where the reason why the subsidy is being removed is clearly communicated. We don't want a repeat of the fuel subsidy removal where there was an abrupt removal and then Nigerians were just left to deal with the consequences with limited support. There should also be support to the poorest in the country, the poorest consumers. And then we should also look at how the funds that should have gone to the subsidy will now be channeled towards developing the power sector, and how power sector companies can become more efficient, what kind of framework should be put in place, what kind of support that they need to increase the quality of power supply to Nigerians, which in the long run will actually reduce the cost of power supply to Nigerians. So essentially, again, to recap, it requires a short-term response and also a long-term response, which will take us to a more developed economy where people are able to afford basic things like electricity.
Looking at how much energy people use compared to the population, because if you look at our population, it's quite huge, over 200 million people. How balanced is the market in terms of supply and demand?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So in terms of consumption, I mean, one key statistic that that is actually really true is that a refrigerator in the US consumes more electricity than the average Nigerian consumer. Like if you take the electricity consumption per capita of most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, you see that we consume less than a refrigerator in the US. And that just shows how bad that supply-demand balance is. According to the World Bank, just less than 50% of Nigerians don't have access to the grid, and most of these people are concentrated in rural areas. So in terms of demand, there is like we have 200 million Nigerians, but in terms of electricity consumption, with most of the population being poor, it means that our consumption might actually also be low in relative terms to, like, if you compare to more developed countries. And this is because in developed countries, like the appliances that people use, like refrigerators, microwaves, things like that, in Nigeria, only a few people can afford those kinds of appliances, which means that overall electricity consumption is low. But coming to supply and demand, we see that at best, the peak that Nigerian consumers have been supplied from the grid is just 5,000 megawatts, which is frighteningly low for a country of 200 million people. And even in terms of demand, so we know that there is demand because we have the population. But like I said, because of the poverty rates and just what kind of appliances people use, we might not see that much demand. But even at that, 5,000 megawatts is frighteningly low, especially when you consider that most people aren't even connected to the grid because of the issues that we mentioned in the past, with power sector companies not being efficient, not being able to extend the grid because they don't have enough revenue to even invest in their networks. Essentially, it's a double whammy. So on the one hand, we really need to increase electricity supply in Nigeria. I mean, within the past 3 weeks. I'm sure you've also experienced this with poorer electricity supply because of gas constraints and also lower hydro generation. So we're seeing that electricity supply now is actually really low. And then when you compare that to demand, you're seeing that the supply we have is not able to meet the demand that is available. But if we start talking about even connecting more people to the grid, that means we even need more electricity supply. A rough rule of thumb is that 1,000 people require 1 megawatt. So if you do the math, you see that Nigeria needs over 10 times of what we're currently consuming. And so essentially, we do have a supply-demand imbalance, which is why we're seeing things like load shedding, lower supply to Nigerian households. But also in the long term, we will need to, if we see Nigerian consumers becoming more wealthy or having more income, then the required supply will even be more than what we're seeing today.
Looking at how much energy people use compared to the population, because if you look at our population, it's quite huge, over 200 million people. How balanced is the market in terms of supply and demand?
Well, if you look at the IMF's motivations, which is always an important lens when you're getting recommendations from multilateral organizations, their motivation is to get Nigeria to a place where we have some sort of fiscal balance, for lack of a better word, where revenues and expenditures are balanced and our deficit is reduced. So that means reducing unnecessary spending. And in their opinion, subsidies are unnecessary spending. When you look at the fact that subsidies are just a short-term, or should actually just be a short-term benefit. So in times when electricity prices are high or prices are high for a short period, you see countries implement subsidies. And then after, when they're able to fix the structural issues and get prices to where they should be, then they implement a subsidy. Then they remove the subsidy. And this is for countries that have the money to afford a subsidy. When you talk about Nigeria, a country that is grappling with so many developmental issues, from education to healthcare, to the power sector, to electricity, and even other sectors in between, you see that we actually can't afford a subsidy. Like I said, the subsidies that we implemented in the past between 2013 and since privatization of the power sector, have not even been paid. There's a backlog that is being owed to generation companies and gas supply companies. So essentially, from the IMF's perspective, like, where is the money for the subsidy going to come from? All this is going to do is increase the deficit that's owed to the generation companies and gas supply companies, which is contributing to the issues that we're seeing now, where supply companies aren't able to increase their capacity and aren't able to supply to Nigerians. So from the IMF has a good point on this, because Nigeria actually cannot afford to pay the electricity subsidy. I mean, we removed the fuel subsidy because we couldn't afford it. So bringing on an electricity subsidy is just putting us back where we're coming from, instead of focusing on how to increase spending on capital projects and development projects, actually fix the structural issues in the sector. Or even if there's a subsidy, there should be a plan to take us out of the subsidy regime, or out of a place where Nigeria needs a subsidy, to where Nigerian consumers are now self-reliant. And so I'll say that I agree with the IMF. The IMF has a good view. If you look at their motivations, they are actually like pushing us towards the right direction.
Well, I think we'll just have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Noel Okwedi, Senior Energy Analyst at STEERS. Thank you for coming on Business Week.
Thank you, Frank.
Well, that's our show today. Thank you so much for your time. I am Frank Omalape.